Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The rain came down like it had something to say, loud and relentless, drumming against the rusted rooftops of the slum where Mark lived with his mother. The walls of their one-room home were thin and cracked, soaked with moisture that never fully dried, no matter the season. Ediora, Mark's mother, was already awake, kneeling on the cement floor as she scrubbed clothes in a shallow basin. Her fingers were raw from years of soap and water, but her movements were steady, almost graceful. Mark watched her from the corner of the room, sitting cross-legged on the mattress they shared, a thin blanket draped over his shoulders. He was 9 years old, but already used to silence. He didn't ask where his father was, not anymore. The few times he had, she only looked away, her eyes distant, as if the question pulled her back into something she didn't want to revisit. There was no photograph, no name, not even a hint in the way she spoke. Whoever he was, Mark had learned not to ask. Instead, he watched her hands, the way they moved through the water, as if they could wash away the weight she carried. They lived in a part of town that people didn't write about. The roads were broken, full of potholes and dust, and the smell of burning plastic was a permanent perfume in the air. Neighbors were loud, but no one listened. Arguments broke out in the night, about money, about food, about husbands who didn't come home. But in their room, it was always quiet. Ediora kept things neat even when they had nothing. Their clothes were second-hand, sometimes third, and Mark's school uniform never fit quite right. He wore shoes with different laces and a backpack with a broken zipper, but he never complained. Ediora walked him to school each day, then went off to work as a cleaner in one of the high-rise buildings across town. She came back with aching legs and a tired smile, always asking if he had eaten, even when she hadn't. On Sundays, when she didn't work, they'd sit by the window and listen to music on an old radio with a coat hanger for an antenna. It was their version of peace. The world outside was loud and uncertain, but in that room, with its peeling walls and quiet dreams, they found a rhythm. Mark had no surname on the school registry. The teachers called him Mark A., as though the rest of his name had slipped through the cracks. He didn't care much. He wasn't the kind to talk in class or fight for attention. But he noticed everything, the way some kids had lunchboxes packed with snacks, how others got picked up in cars that hummed instead of coughed. He envied them quietly. Sometimes he would sit at the back of the classroom, tracing invisible letters on his desk, wondering if his father might be rich or kind or even alive. But the truth was, he felt invisible, half-made. At night, he'd watch his mother sleep beside him, her chest rising and falling steadily, and he'd feel a dull ache in his chest. Not because he wanted more, but because he knew she deserved better. He didn't know how yet, but even at 9, he knew that something had to change. He couldn't say it, couldn't explain it, but something inside him was already reaching for a way out. The morning started like any other, a pale, early light slipping through the slits in the wooden shutters, casting narrow beams across the floor. Mark woke to the sound of birds calling somewhere outside, distant and sharp. The air was cool, still heavy with the scent of last night's rain, and he reached instinctively toward the other side of the mattress, where his mother always lay. His fingers met fabric, but not warmth. The space beside him was empty. That in itself wasn't strange. She often rose before him, sometimes just to sit and pray quietly before the noise of the world crept in. But this morning felt different. The silence was thicker than usual. The house, usually alive with the subtle movement of Adora's routines, the clink of enamel cups, the shuffle of her slippers, the soft scrape of her washing basin, was now still. Mark sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. "Mama," he called softly. No answer. The quiet deepened, and with it, a sudden cold awareness began to press into his skin. He found her curled in the corner of the room, beside the wall where her plastic bucket sat stacked. Her head rested awkwardly against the cement, eyes closed, hands limp in her lap. At first, he thought she was just sleeping, overworked again, maybe too tired to even make it back to the bed. He stepped closer, still half dreaming, still unwilling to believe the growing sense of wrongness clawing at his chest. "Mama," he said again, louder this time. Her body didn't stir. The light caught her face in a way that made it look older, as if years had arrived overnight. He touched her shoulder, gently shook her. Nothing. A sound escaped his throat, something between a whisper and a sob, as he dropped to his knees. Her skin was cool. Her lips slightly parted, eyes unmoving. He didn't understand what death truly was, not yet, but in that moment, he knew something irreversible had happened. Time didn't slow down. The sounds outside, the dogs barking, a woman calling to her child, the occasional vroom of a passing kiki, all kept going, but inside that room, it was as if the world had forgotten how to breathe. The neighbors came after he ran into the street, barefoot and wide-eyed, yelling her name like maybe she'd hear it if enough people called. Women wrapped in wrappers rushed in with prayers and shaky hands. One of them pulled Mark to her chest, but he didn't feel it. He sat on the doorstep while they argued about what to do, who to call, how to afford a burial. No one asked him what he wanted. The body was taken away 2 hours later in a rickety pickup truck that smelt of diesel and sweat. After that, the days blurred. People brought food, old clothes, promises they wouldn't keep, but none of them stayed. There were no relatives close enough or willing to take him in. A neighbor let him sleep in a shed behind their shop for a few nights, but by the end of the week, Mark was left to himself. The landlord locked up their room, his mother's few belongings sold off to settle unpaid rent. Mark didn't cry much, not because he didn't want to, but because crying didn't change anything. Hunger came next, then cold. And slowly, as the sky returned to its usual shade of uncaring gray, Mark began to walk in directions he didn't understand, toward places where boys his age disappeared into corners and came back harder. The day his mother died wasn't the day he lost her. It was the day the world reminded him he was alone. The streets did not welcome Mark. They tolerated him. Days bled into nights in a haze of wandering feet and empty hands. He learned quickly where to linger and where to vanish, corners with shade in the heat, alleyways with less broken glass. The faces around him changed often, some boys older than him, others just as young but already sharp-eyed, hollow-cheeked, and faster than their shadows. Mark watched them like a student learning a new language. He saw how they moved, how they avoided the police, how they slid hands into bags and pockets without being noticed. Hunger turned from ache to instinct. The first thing he stole was a mango, snatched from a roadside tray when the seller bent to tie her wrapper. He ran until his legs burned and didn't stop until he was hidden behind a row of parked trucks, juice from the fruit dripping down his chin. It wasn't just food he tasted that day. It was the dizzy rush of survival, raw and unclean. That night he didn't sleep. He lay awake beneath a footbridge, heart still racing, wondering what his mother would have said, but the silence around him didn't offer answers. It never did. Weeks passed, and Mark grew thinner, but harder too. He learned to mask his fear with stillness, his pain with silence. The streets respected those who didn't flinch. One evening, while watching a group of boys dice up a loaf of bread behind a mechanic's shop, he caught the eye of a tall boy with a faded scar running from his temple to his jaw. The boy nodded once, then tossed him a piece of the bread without saying a word. That's how it started, with bread and silence. The boy's name was Stone, and he was part of a group that operated out of the abandoned cinema on Ojelegba Road. They weren't a gang in the way movies portrayed them. There were no colors, no names etched into walls. Just boys, mostly orphans or runaways, who had learned that brotherhood was safer than solitude. They took Mark in after Stone spoke for him. No ceremony, no promises. The only rule was loyalty. You don't snitch, you don't fold, you don't leave without permission. Mark didn't hesitate. He'd already lost everything worth waiting for. Living among the boys felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, exhilarating, but always one step from a fall. They weren't just thieves. They were lookouts, runners, muscle for hire, when the market lords needed a message delivered. Mark was small, which made him useful. He slipped through crowds like smoke, picked locks with hands steady from hunger. At night, they sat on the cinema roof, passing bottles and stories, laughing at things that weren't funny. Sometimes, when someone didn't come back, the others stayed silent. There were no funerals here. Mark, now 14, began to earn respect, not through violence, but precision. He never got caught, never hesitated. He still didn't talk much, but they started calling him Ghost because he moved like one, there one moment, gone the next. Yet beneath all the grime and grit, he never forgot the quiet of his old home, the rhythm of his mother's breathing, the warm warmth of their mattress. He didn't talk about her, but in the still moments before sleep, when the city seemed to pause, he held her memory like a blade, sharp, hidden, always close to the heart. It was supposed to be routine, an easy job, in and out. The target was a small provision shop tucked beneath a row of cracked apartments, the kind of place run by tired old men or distracted young women, too frail or naive to notice a hand slipping beneath the counter. Mark had watched it for 3 days from across the road, eating roasted corn and memorizing every pattern. The girl who ran the shop was quiet, always in the same loose-fitting dresses, her hair pulled into a low bun, her movements unhurried. She didn't laugh loudly like other girls her age. She didn't talk much either. She'd hum softly under her breath while arranging biscuits and sachets of milk, like the world outside her shop didn't concern her. Mark waited until the hour between late afternoon and early evening, when the streets were restless but distracted, when shopkeepers were weary and customers thinned out. He stepped in with his head low, one hand in his jacket pocket, where a kitchen knife stayed hidden, not to use, but to show. The plan was to make her afraid. Fear made people obedient. But she didn't react the way she was supposed to. When he stepped inside, the chime above the door tinkling, she didn't even look up right away. She was squatting beside a crate of malt drinks, arranging them carefully by expiration date. When she finally turned, her eyes landed on his face, then dropped to the outline of the knife bulging beneath his jacket. Still, she didn't move back. She stood slowly, wiped her palms on her dress, and looked at him, not with panic or pleading, but with the kind of curiosity that made him uncomfortable. "Are you hungry?" she asked, her voice so soft it almost didn't reach him. Mark froze. He wasn't sure he'd heard right. She gestured toward a packet of cabin biscuits on the counter. "Take it," she said, "but don't scare me again." Her tone wasn't stern, but it wasn't weak either. It was steady, like she saw through him and wasn't frightened by what she found. Mark blinked, fingers curling tighter inside his pocket. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not with gentleness, not with understanding. He backed away without touching anything, eyes never leaving hers. Before he stepped out, she smiled not wide, just a little. Enough to make him feel like she knew something he didn't. The next day, he came back, this time without the knife. He told himself he just wanted to know if she'd remember him. She did. She didn't call him out, didn't raise an alarm. She asked if he liked cabin biscuits and gave him another pack, no strings. Mark didn't know how to act. He wasn't used to kindness without motive. Her name, he would later learn, was Nkiru. She wasn't like the others. She didn't ask about his scars or where he lived. She never asked for favors or explanations. Over the weeks, he kept finding himself near her shop, offering to fix a broken hinge on the wooden shelf, carrying in crates when she restocked. Sometimes they didn't speak much. Sometimes they did. She had a calm way about her, like someone who had seen her share of pain but refused to let it harden her. To Mark, she was an anomaly, a soft thread in a rough world. He started to feel different around her, unguarded, unsure, but somehow safer. She didn't fear the darkness he carried. She just chose not to feed it. The days took on a quiet rhythm, not planned, just unfolding. Mark would linger near Nkiru's shop most mornings, pretending to be passing through, though both of them knew better. She never pressed him, never asked why he kept coming. He sometimes helped her open up, lifting the metal shutter, straightening the crates, and other times he simply sat on the wooden stool by the entrance, watching as she swept the floor and arranged her shelves. There was a stillness about her space, a kind of peace he couldn't name, but kept coming back for. She played old high-life songs on a small radio, the sound scratchy but warm, and once in a while she would hum along. The shop smelled like groundnut oil, mint sweets, and something else, something clean. When customers came, Mark would move aside, slipping into the shadows until they left. He didn't want to be seen, not with her, not yet. One afternoon, when the sun cast soft gold across the street, she handed him a bottle of cold water without a word. He took it. Their fingers brushed, and though it lasted barely a second, something shifted. It wasn't a spark. It was gentler, like the first breeze before rain. Nkiru was unlike anyone Mark had ever known. She didn't carry herself like she was trying to impress anyone. She asked questions that caught him off guard, not about what he did, but about what he thought. "Do you ever draw?" she asked one day after catching him sketching lines into the dust with a stick. "No," he replied, almost embarrassed, brushing the ground clean with his foot. She nodded, not pushing. Later, she brought him a small notepad and a pencil wrapped in brown paper. "Try," she said simply. It stunned him, this idea that someone believed he could do something besides survive. Mark started showing up even when he had work with the crew. Sometimes he was late to meetings, sometimes he didn't show at all. Stone noticed. The others muttered about him going soft, distracted, but no one challenged him outright. Not yet. He still pulled his weight when it mattered. Still, something had changed. He began to wonder what it might feel like to have a different kind of life, not just safer, but fuller. To wake up without fear, to sit without watching the door. And more than anything, to keep showing up at the same place for the same person without pretending it was by accident. It wasn't long before Nkiru asked the question he had been avoiding. It was a late evening, the sun gone, the shop locked up, and they sat together on the cement step, the street behind them empty except for the hum of distant traffic. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "What are you afraid of, Mark?" The name sounded softer when she said it, not sharp like others made it. He didn't answer right away. His hands were clasped between his knees, his shoulders stiff. "Of becoming someone I can't come back from," he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. She didn't flinch. She looked at him, steady and quiet, then said, "Then don't." "Come back." It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. A small, powerful offer of return. That night, as he walked back through the narrow alleys toward the cinema ruins where the crew met, Mark felt a restlessness inside him. He didn't know how to leave the life he was in, not yet, but for the first time in years, he wanted to. And that want, small and trembling, felt like the beginning of something that could be called hope. It was never supposed to be complicated. Just another hit on a warehouse used by small-scale suppliers, the kind of job Stone preferred, low security, high return. Mark had agreed to it weeks before things with Nkiru grew into something he hadn't fully understood yet, before her voice became the one that echoed in his mind during silent nights. He told himself it would be the last. One more job, then he'd walk away. Maybe get work moving goods at the motor park, or something more honest. Nkiru didn't know about the job, and he didn't offer. He couldn't. There was a line between who he was with her and who he had to be with the crew, and that night That line stretched thinner than ever. The warehouse was on the outskirts of town, near a swampy stretch where few dared to go after dark. The plan was tight. 2 in the front, 2 in the back, Mark inside for the keys. He moved like muscle memory, every step calculated. No rush, no mess. But something felt off. There was a wrongness in the air, something too still, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm or just after a mistake. They got in, took what they came for, electronics mostly. Portable speakers, phones, and chargers packed in dusty cartons. But as they exited, headlights flared from the side road, cutting through the dark like a blade. Mark's breath caught. It wasn't police, at least not uniformed, but someone had tipped them off. Voices shouted from the trees, feet pounding. The crew scattered, each man for himself. Mark bolted down a side path, through mud and mosquito clouds, lungs burning. He didn't stop until he reached a small drainage tunnel that led back toward the market. He hid there, drenched, heart thudding. In the hours that followed, whispers came fast. Someone got caught, another shot in the leg. But Mark stayed clean. The police didn't come for him. He went home, wiped his hands clean, and when Kiru saw him the next day, she noticed his limp but didn't ask. He told her it was nothing, and then he didn't speak of it again. Weeks passed, then months. The crew grew quieter, more careful. Mark, meanwhile, slowly pulled back, one toe at a time, until the only thing connecting him to that past was the memory of it and the secret it still held. By the time he turned 20, Mark was no longer a boy hiding under bridges or slipping into back rooms with stolen keys. He was a man trying to be better, learning to listen, to stay still without feeling like he had to run. He and Kiru had grown inseparable. She didn't ask about his past, but she knew. There were questions in her eyes she didn't voice, trust given without conditions. He found part-time work loading crates for a delivery company, saved what he could, and when he asked her to marry him, he did it without pretense. There was no ring, just a question spoken under a quiet sky, with his hand over hers. She said yes, not because the future was certain, but because they had survived the uncertain together. They married quietly, no fanfare, just a few neighbors and a borrowed suit. The life he now lived was small, but it was his. For the first time, Mark believed he had escaped. But the thing about the past is that it doesn't knock, it waits. And the job he thought was buried under time and silence had never truly been forgotten. It lingered, like smoke in a closed room, waiting for the right moment to choke. It began with a knock, slow, deliberate, the kind that didn't belong to a friend. Mark opened the door halfway, squinting into the dusk. A man stood there, unfamiliar, with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. He asked for someone else, a name Mark didn't recognize. Mark shook his head, gave a short answer, and closed the door. But the man lingered outside for a moment longer than necessary, just standing there, before walking off. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the mattress while Kiru rested, her belly just starting to swell beneath her wrapper. She didn't stir when he rose and moved to the window. Outside, the street was empty, but the feeling wasn't. Something had shifted. He couldn't explain it, not even to himself, but he knew the way a hunter walked. He had once been one. The past wasn't coming in loud or angry. It was coming in quiet, measured steps, like it knew exactly where to find him. Over the next few days, the signs sharpened. He noticed faces that didn't belong in the neighborhood, too still, too aware. A boy loitering near the provision stand too long, a man reading a newspaper without turning the page. Once, while returning from work, he saw a flash of a figure ducking behind a parked car. He didn't chase. There was no point. Mark knew when he was being watched. He also knew what it meant, the warehouse job. Something had gone wrong then, more wrong than he was told. Perhaps money went missing. Perhaps someone was betrayed. Whatever it was, they were digging now, and somehow the trail had circled back to him. He didn't tell Kira right away. She was glowing these days, her laughter softer, her steps slower. He didn't want to infect that peace with fear. But it pressed on him daily, a weight he carried beneath his ribs. He began to sleep lightly, a knife hidden beneath the bed frame again, like in the old days. Kira noticed the change in him, how often he stared into nothing, how quickly he looked over his shoulder, but she said nothing. She trusted he would speak when he was ready. It was a quiet Sunday morning when the past finally walked in. Mark was at the backyard well, drawing water, when he heard footsteps. Not rushed, not loud, just steady. He turned to see Stone, older, leaner, but still with the same scar cutting his face like punctuation. They stared at each other for a long moment, neither speaking. Then Stone smiled, not warmly. "You've done well for yourself," he said. "Looks peaceful." Mark didn't answer. Stone stepped closer, picked up a fallen leaf, turned it in his hand. "You left without a word, Ghost. That hurt some people." His tone was even, but there was heat beneath it. "There's something they need you to answer for. You understand, don't you?" Mark met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not part of that life anymore," he said. Stone nodded slowly, as if he'd expected the answer. "Doesn't matter. The ground thinks you are." He dropped the leaf, turned, and walked away, leaving dust in his wake. Mark stood there, the bucket of water forgotten at his feet. He knew then it was no longer a question of if they would come, but when. Mark told Nyeru 2 nights later, sitting beside her in the dark, their hands folded together like prayer. He didn't give her all the details, he never had, but enough for her to understand. That something from his old life was reaching for him, slow but certain, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. Kira didn't cry. She didn't panic. She listened, her eyes steady and quiet in the candlelight. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. "We'll face it," she said. "Whatever it is, we'll face it." But Mark shook his head. "This isn't something we can face together," he said. "This is something I have to end." She looked away, her thumb brushing the edge of her belly, her silence heavier than any words. That night they slept curled into each other like the world outside didn't exist, but both knew it did, and both knew it was coming closer. In the following days, Mark prepared, not loudly, not with panic, but with the same quiet calculation he had once used to survive. He sold his phone, changed his route to work, and started watching the watchers. He knew the signs, they weren't hiding anymore. It was a message. He stayed indoors more, only stepping out to run errands or buy food, never alone for long. His eyes scanned every face, his ears tuned to every strange noise. Stone's visit wasn't a warning. It was a prelude. Something had gone wrong after that warehouse job, and someone had to pay. Maybe they thought Mark knew where the missing money was. Maybe they just needed someone to take the fall. Either way, his refusal to return made him a liability, and liabilities don't get second chances. One evening, while returning from the clinic with Nkiru after a routine checkup, he noticed a bike trailing them at a distance. It turned when they did. It stopped when they paused. Mark's pulse quickened. He gripped Nkiru's hand tighter and led her through a series of side streets until the bike disappeared behind them. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Later that night, after making sure she was asleep, Mark stepped outside. The sky was moonless, the air heavy with the smell of dust and smoke. He sat on the front step, smoking a cigarette he'd found buried deep in an old tin. He hadn't touched one in years. He stared into the street, thinking about his mother, about the boy he used to be, about the strange, broken path that had led him here, husband, soon to be father, and still hunted. He didn't want Kiru to see what might come next. He didn't want her near it. His mind circled the same thought again and again. If they wanted him, They would have to come get him, but far away from where she slept. The next morning, before she woke, he packed a small bag, a torchlight, some cash, a pocket knife. No words left behind, only a note. Protecting you is the only thing that matters. I'll end this. Wait for me. Then he stepped into the quiet dawn, heart heavy, feet certain. He didn't know if he'd return, but he knew he wouldn't run. The old cinema grounds hadn't changed much. Cracked concrete, rusted scaffolding, and weeds clawing through every forgotten inch. But the silence felt deeper now, like the ghosts of all they'd done here had multiplied in his absence. Mark moved through the ruins like a man retracing footsteps he'd buried years ago. Every corner stirred memories of whispered plans, split loot, blood-stained arguments, and the brief thrill of escape. He didn't flinch. This place had made him once. It would unmake him now. He didn't come with fear. He came with resolve. If he was going to end this, he had to face it from the belly. The shadows welcomed him as if they'd been waiting. By midday, he found what he was looking for, an abandoned structure once used as their hideout. It had been boarded up, but not locked. Mark pushed through, the stale air thick with the smell of dust and rust. And there, like actors waiting for a scene to begin, they sat, 3 of them, older, rougher, but unchanged in essence. Stone stood when he entered, and the others followed, the tension spreading like wildfire. Stone gave a slow nod, like he respected that Mark had come alone, but there was no warmth in his eyes. "You shouldn't have run, Ghost," he said. "That's not how family works." Mark didn't bother correcting him. This was never family. It was survival. "I came to settle this," he said, his voice low. "You want answers? I don't have them. You want blood? Take mine, but leave her out of it." Stone scoffed, pacing now. "You disappeared after the warehouse. You think we didn't notice? Money went missing, Ghost. A whole crate. That wasn't a coincidence." Mark's brow furrowed, heart beginning to pound. He hadn't touched that money. He remembered what they took, what they left. But it didn't matter. The story had already been written in their heads. Guilt by absence. "You know I wouldn't do that," he said, though the words felt hollow in this place. The others stayed silent, eyes shifting. It wasn't about truth. It was about tying up loose ends. Stone pulled a small gun from his waistband, not aiming, just holding it, talking with it. "You think love makes you clean?" he asked. "It doesn't. You walked out with dirt on you, and now you think silence makes you innocent." Mark's hand inched toward the knife in his pocket, but he didn't pull it. Not yet. Not until he had to. Then the first move came, not from Stone, but from one of the others, a younger man who had once followed Mark like a shadow. He lunged, fast and wild. Mark ducked, knife drawn now, instinct snapping back like a reflex. The fight wasn't clean. It never was. Rusted shelves collapsed, dust clouds rose, fists and blades tangled in tight, brutal flashes. Mark moved with desperation, not anger, each movement rooted in the need to finish it before it followed him home. He injured one, slashed another. But Stone was waiting. When Mark turned, too slow, Stone pulled the trigger. Once. Then twice. The sound echoed across the empty cinema. Mark staggered, clutching his side, the world tilting. But he didn't fall immediately. He charged. The 2 of them crashed against a wall, grappling like animals. Mark drove the knife into Stone's side just once, deep, sharp, final. They both collapsed. Breathing slowed. Light faded. And in that moment, Mark thought only of her, and Kiru, smiling in the morning light, her hands on her belly, waiting. His eyes blurred, but his chest held no fear, only peace. He had come back to the fire to end what he started, and he had done it. The call came at dawn, long before the neighborhood had stirred awake. Kiru was seated on the edge of the bed, her hands gently wrapped around the swell of her belly, when the knock came. Two men stood at the door, one in plain clothes, the other in uniform. They didn't speak right away, just looked at her like they didn't want to say what had to be said. She knew before they opened their mouths. Knew it in the way her heart went still, in the sudden quiet that wrapped around her like a shroud. The officer stepped forward, eyes lowered, voice soft. He was found early this morning. There was an altercation. He didn't survive it. The words didn't land all at once. They came in pieces, floating around her, then sinking slowly into her chest. She thanked them, her voice steady, her body unmoving. She closed the door gently, then turned back to the silence of their small room. Mark's shoes were still by the door. His toothbrush still leaned against hers. Nothing looked out of place, yet everything had changed. She walked through the house as if touching each item might bring him back. The cup he used for tea, the old notepad he sometimes doodled in, his shirt still drying on the line. Her hands lingered on them all, tracing the spaces where he once was. And then she found the letter, folded neatly, tucked beneath the wrapper on the bedside table. The writing was rough, like he'd scribbled it quickly but carefully. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. I'm sorry I couldn't be more, stay longer, love harder. But I hope you know, every quiet moment with you, every laugh, every morning, I carried it like treasure. You gave me a life I didn't think I deserved. Make our child brave. Tell them their father was once lost, but he found the way home through you. That was when the tears came, slow at first, then sharp and heavy. She sank to the floor, the letter clutched against her chest, and wept until the sun filtered through the curtains, and the birds dared to sing again. Weeks passed, slow and dull like the aftertaste of grief. The neighborhood whispered in sympathy, offering food, prayers, and silence. But Nkiru carried herself gently, not as someone broken, but as someone who had loved deeply and been changed by it. She gave birth to a baby boy under heavy rain, the sound of it thrumming against the roof like distant footsteps. She named him Chimazi, God sent, not because she was religious, but because something about him felt like a message, a reason to go on. In the evenings, she would sit on the porch, rocking him gently, telling him stories, not of violence, but of resilience. She spoke of a man who had once been a shadow, but found the light through love. She spoke of kindness, of choices, of the weight of silence and the power of peace. And though Mark was gone, his presence lingered, in the laughter of their son, in the quiet strength of her walk, in the way she faced each day without fear. The world hadn't spared him, but through Nkiru and Chimazi, his story endured, not as a tragedy, but as a long, hard-fought redemption. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.